What's up, guy? What is up, guy? Welcome back to Josue Has to Say. If you're new here, I am Josue, and this is what I have to say. Before we begin, please remember to like, subscribe, smash that like button, do all the things as it does help the podcast grow. And if you ain't growing, you're rotting. We got a spicy episode today. A very Cubano episode today. Cubanazo. In regards to Raul Castro, which is Fidel Castro's brother, and his secret private, well, his not so secret private life, and how it kind of gave way into the Cuban Revolution, involves the CIA, the Kennedys, the mob. It's a clusterfuck, and it's going to be a spicy episode. So to help me out with this, and the guy who did the footwork for this research, this quote-unquote conspiracy, which I don't think is much of a conspiracy because it's all out there, Adrian Alvarez.
Definitely more than a theory, for sure. Thank you very much, Josue. My fellow Alvarez. I definitely...
You sure we're not related?
We're probably related somehow at some point, man. You know what I mean?
My dad's side of the family got around, so
it's maybe, a small island. No, my dad too. He's got 3 wives and all that. So.
Nice. 5 of mine. So
there you go. They add up. But I really appreciate you having me on, man. This has been a passion project for me, as we talked about this a little bit beforehand in terms of kind of reconnecting with my roots in a lot of ways. And I unearthed this story and found it insane. And considering that, I'm Cuban, yo crecí aquí en Kendall. My parents spoke only Spanish in the house. My grandparents never learned English. I didn't even learn English till I was 6. So it was cubanazo, even though I was born here. And I didn't know this story. And so I think that by kind of putting this out there, hopefully it's early enough in what happened in the situation that there's not this split amongst the island people versus the Miami people in terms of who their rooting interests are. You really see that the revolution's roots in a lot of ways were a fight against a dictator, against tyranny and all that stuff. And the twists and turns that it took because of the events that we're going to be talking about really affected, when you really think about how much the world changed and shifted in the 60s and 50s, and how big of a role, an outsized role, Cuba played during that time frame. I mean, 1 or 2 things change within this storyline. 1 or 2 things change in this history, and you and I aren't sitting here. We're in Cuba, or we don't exist. The domino effect,
yeah, is different.
It's like the butterfly effect, and if a certain person gets assassinated or not assassinated, right. If a certain
it changes the course.
It changes the entire course of the world in a lot of ways. And so, discovering this story that has been kind of known to certain circles, like in the CIA and other places, but really seeing it from a Cuban perspective, I think is going to give a lot of people something to think about with what happened, and how it actually can tell us about what's happening today as well. So yeah, we'll see. I'm excited about it.
So the basis of and you're going to make this, you have various plans for this. It's starting off, it's kind of like a book, comic book.
Yeah.
And then it's venturing off into different mediums.
Yeah. It's when I originally kind of conceived it, honestly, I thought it was going to be a musical. So I'll kind of take you back. 2020, as we all experienced together collectively, was one of those seminal moments in all of our histories that we can kind of go back on. It's like 9/11, the pandemic, all this stuff. Yeah. Everybody has some sort of connection. For me, I got this obsession of seeing my history and all this stuff, ironically, from the musical Hamilton. So I have a kid. He got super excited about Disney Plus when it came out right around the pandemic. It was I think it was November of 2019 when it came out, and then everything goes crazy. One of the things that they released during that time was Hamilton. I think it was during that summer, and he and I started watching it over and over and over again. And probably around the 20th sitting, I thought to myself, man, how awesome is this that you're seeing history and you're giving a context of what happened and giving more understanding of what the actual events transpired instead of just a bunch of dates and other things.
Right.
Maybe there could be something like this for the Cuban Revolution. Maybe there could be something that would kind of give, I want something to exist that gives people more of an understanding of what happened. Like how did we get here? And I started thinking about like, okay, well, if I'm going to go that route, obviously number one people think about with the revolution is Fidel and Raul. And it was one of those where it's like, as a Cuban and growing up here and a Cuban American, I call myself Cuban, but then like the Cubans don't like when I call myself Cuban. And then it's like,
Cuban American.
Cuban American, un cubano, pichón de cubano, as my mom would say. It felt wrong to try to kind of make a story out specifically about the Castros and making them the center stage, and it would feel like to me like Springtime for Hitler, like that fake Broadway show. It didn't feel right, but I was trying to come up with like an angle to it, and you know how Cuban dads are, like Papa Alvarez is the way that they speak amongst themselves and with their children about various officials within the Cuban government. My dad, I always remembered, he'd be like, Raul Castro's un maricón. He just like straight up, right, all the time. It was just one of those, like, it's just kind of like, I was like, it's like, hey, Dad, hey, son, how are you doing? Have a great day. By the way, Raul Castro's maricón. Like, it was just like, side, just a little side thing.
By the way, in case you forgot.
In case you forgot, Raul Castro's maricón. But I started thinking about it, and it was just like, well, what if it's true? I mean, I'd kind of heard rumors and stuff, so I Googled it. That's what you do. This generation, you figure, it's like, hey, what is this? Google. And you can try this out at home as well. If you Google the words Raul Castro homosexual right now on your Google machine, the first thing that's going to pop up is archives.com or something to that effect, where it is an archive of the CIA's releases for the JFK assassination, which they were required to do after a 1992 law. It's 2016. They released thousands of documents, and amongst them was this one, where on the second paragraph, if you look at it, it says 1959. Raul Castro is a known homosexual, and he was caught making advances with Cubela. And I'm like, what? I'm like, number one, I'm like, wait.
Like, who's Cubela? Yeah.
First, this is confirmed by the CIA, and like this is the known thing, number one. And then second, I'm like, who the fuck is this Cubela guy? Like, I'd never heard of him before.
Which is the title of the book, Cubela Libre.
Cubela Libre. And so if you Google him, he was a comandante, but originally he was a student at the University of Havana. Childhood friends with a guy named Jose Antonio Echevarria, who I had also kind of heard of before. It was like a scholarship at FIU named after him. I had heard a few things, but nothing, in depth. And that guy was basically the leader of the student rebellion in the University of Havana against Batista. So in 1952, in March of 1952, the president at the time was Carlos Priyo Socarrás. He was part of the Auténtico
Related
Party.
to that guy.
Are you?
Yeah.
There you go. That guy, his party was pretty corrupt, but it was one of those things where...
Sounds like my blood.
It's one of those things where there was at least stability. There was a lot of gangsterism in the 40s and stuff. Yeah. The Constitution of Cuba was enacted in 1940. It was the Constitution of 1940. Ironically enough, while Batista was the president at the time, the first go-around of him being the president, after he actually had his own revolt in 1933. So he actually did two coups during his time frame in Cuba. He did a coup called the Sergeants' Revolt in 1933 against the government of Machado. It was like a uprising by the military. He was a mulatto, so it was like a big thing instead of the white guys in power. Brought him up. He was very charismatic. He wasn't president at first, but he was always the guy pulling the strings because he controlled the army. He ended up leaving, went to Miami for a few years, made a bunch of money, came back to the island and became a senator so that he could position himself for the 1952 election, which was going to be held in June of that year. But at the same time, there was a guy named Eddie Chivas, who was kind of like a combination of like Bernie Sanders and Jon Stewart in a lot of ways. He was railing against corruption. He had a Sunday night show at 8 p.m. on Havana's radio that everybody used to tune into. He used to film it in like a big studio with like a giant audience.
Do you know the name?
Caracol. It was four letters of the studio. I'll look it up in a second. Yeah. But it was one of the studios in Havana. Sunday nights at 8 p.m. Always did his show. He had been railing against a few years before this guy Jose Aleman had been the Secretary of State, I believe, or something to that effect, and he had taken about $300 million from the Treasury. Wow. At that point, and fun fact, he bought like half of Key Biscayne and owned the Miami Stadium while he was over here as well.
Wow.
So, there's a whole connection with Aleman. If you Google his son Aleman Jr., who's going to be a character in this thing, that guy, he ended up killing himself in the 80s.
Wink, wink.
Right before he was going to testify for some stuff.
Nice, yeah.
But
that's typically how they die, yeah.
How they die. But that guy, so this guy originally railing against that guy, Chivas was railing against that guy. In the upcoming election, the president, Prio, who he had also been railing against for corruption, decided not to run against because he had, had some issues on the corruption side, but his Secretary of Education, Aurelio Sanchez, was going to be running, and he was the authentico candidate for June. Chivas was trying to basically say that this guy had all these properties in Guatemala, all these other things, couldn't find proof. They started kind of doubting him and making fun of him because he said he had this briefcase that he'd walk around with, and they'd say like, "Oh, where's your briefcase?" Open the briefcase. So he started feeling like the heat of not being followed, and not people weren't really paying attention to the anti-corruption message he did. The guy's a little crazy, so one day during his show, in the middle of his show, actually at the end of his show, he does this whole huge rant about Aurelio Sanchez and the current administration, how they're so corrupt, and that he's so passionate about it. This is my final cry. That at the end of his show, he pulls a gun out, points it at his stomach, and shoots himself.
And during the show?
During the show. At the end of the show.
That's one way to go out.
Now, well, the craziest part was that they had cut to commercial already. so nobody heard it. But they heard after the fact because it was in the middle of a studio audience, and everybody went crazy. They didn't know what the shot was.
I would be so pissed. I'd be so fucking pissed. Like if I just fucking off myself on live radio and it didn't even.
He didn't die right away. He didn't die right away. He actually was hospitalized for 11 days, and he was remorseful about it.
Yeah, thinking about how much of a failure I am because I couldn't even get it right.
Right, and then he ended up dying 11 days later.
Wow.
So huge movement. He had started a new party called the Ortodoxo Party. So he was going to be the candidate in June for it. I think what he was thinking that he would try to do that, make himself a martyr, and then not die, and then that would kind of propel him to the presidency.
That failed too.
Apparently, he had shot himself before. So this was
this is like a thing.
This is like a thing.
This is like a thing for him.
I realized this after, and I'm like, oh, this is like a strategy that he's had in the past. So whatever. Point is, the dude dies. Who ends up taking up his mantle and who's trying to take over his TV show, radio show, which he doesn't because there's a lot of politics involved? Fidel Castro. Now, Fidel at that point was a lawyer. He had already been kind of known in Havana. He had actually been accused of murder during all the Ganstorismo things. So he was a known figure, but not kind of sullied in a lot of ways. He had been trying to win the presidency of the FEU all 4 years while he was there, and he failed all 4 years. So he had been really trying to win something in some capacity. And in 52, he was running for Congress under the Ortodoxo Party. So he was already highly polling. It looked like he was going to end up winning.
That's the party this guy that shot himself.
That's the party that this guy shot himself. And he was trying to kind of take up his mantle. What ended up happening is the cousin of the guy, Roberto Agramonte, took up his mantle and ended up becoming the new candidate for president at that point. Now, because of all this craziness, in the polls in December of 51, Agramonte was number 1, Sanchez was number 2, and Batista was number 3. Very, very far trailing the other two candidates. At around this time, and the book goes into it a little bit, Batista had huge connections with the mob in the U.S. And if there's one book that I would recommend to take a look at, check out Havana Nocturne. It's by T.J. English. amazing book that goes really in depth into Batista and into the mob's kind of foray into Cuba and basically trying to create its own criminal state.
Okay.
So that they can do that. And Batista and this guy Meyer Lansky were very close. Meyer Lansky offered.
Where was this Meyer Lansky from?
Meyer Lansky is
That's not Cuban.
He's not. He's a Jewish. He was a Jewish New York mob boss.
He just went to Cuba.
This is while Batista was here. He would go back and forth to Cuba. He owned
Gotcha.
the
I thought you were going to say Palacio de los Jugos.
No, Lansky era Palacio de Jugo. No joda. No, he was the Hotel Nacional. He actually owned that. He owned a few of the casinos in Cuba. He had already been kind of making his mark, and he ended up owning the Cabaret Montmartre, which were the first scene of the book takes place there, and I think the Riviera as well. So this guy, very well connected.
What a time!
Yeah, I know. Very, very connected to Batista. He offered Prio $250,000 cash to resign, so that it could be easier for someone to take over like Batista. Prio declined. And in March of 52, what Batista did is he got the army generals on his side, went to Camp Columbia, which is the barracks right near Havana, basically took over and brought a tank to the palace and basically told Prio to get out or they were going to kill him. Prio ends up running to the Mexican embassy. The Mexican embassy doesn't want to take him. So he ends up scrambling and ends up just fleeing the country with a bunch of the treasury at that point. That's a theme of the...
I had no idea that was the...
Yeah.
I think he's like my grandma's like uncle or something like that. So it's
he took some of the money from the treasury. He fled immediately. This was March 10th of 1952. There was one death in the entire... It was almost bloodless. It was like one security guard that they killed. Other than that, everybody... and 3 days later, the U.S. recognized the new regime because Batista is somebody we know. It's not he's anti-communist at that point. And the only people that really made a huge stink about it were the university students. The university in Havana is a little bit strange in that it itself is its own, almost its own island. It has its own governance. It had its own police force. It had its own like autonomy outside of the government. So it was a little bit strange in that it was almost like home base. Like if you ran to the university, technically the jurisdiction of the cops outside wasn't on the university.
It's like yelling sanctuary in a church or something
basically,
like that.
But it was kind of made that way. I think that comes from a lot of the history of the rebellions coming from the university and kind of them keeping their own power outside of the military and the government. So
wasn't the university funded by the government?
The university... Sort of, but it was also. I think it's more like the traditional thing.
Okay.
Of like,
it was a cultural thing.
It was its own institution, and it was like a tradition of having it kind of be independent. Batista didn't give a fuck; they would send people in anyway after the fact. But it was like that was like the norm at the time, if you will. Jose Antonio, he was a student at the time, and he was studying architecture, and he started leading a bunch of student protests. Started doing, he was very close with Prio, so he would kind of get funding from Prio to kind of do some of these things, to organize these things. And Cubela was his very good friend from childhood. What ends up happening is it keeps building up and building up. About a year and a half after...
Cubela was childhood friends with...
Jose Antonio Echevarria, who was the leader of the students in there. What ends up happening, so Batista's super oppressive. He's basically completely censoring everyone. He's trying to control the situation as much as possible. He has cops out there beating people in the streets, murdering people. There was a lawyer that was trying to kind of go against him. And then
this was the 40s?
This is 1952. So 1952... He starts really cracking down. It starts calming down around the late 52 era just because there's not that many people trying to fight. The U.S. had they were completely behind Batista because it was just easy for them to support somebody that, hey, you're going to keep our interests in mind? Yep. Hey, you're going to make us money? Yep. Hey, you're not going to be communist? Yep. All right.
Sold.
Check. Yep. Done. Enjoy your time. But in July of 1953, Fidel, after having tried to do some legal means and try to do like some lawsuits in the east part of the country, ends up putting together a raid of the Moncada barracks in July 26th of 1953, trying to take over the barracks with an idea of like if they get the weapons, then they can kind of take over, and then they have the spot. And almost every rebellion that's happened in Cuba started from the east to the west, because it's just the way that it worked. It was always the peasants on the side, or the Havana power versus the Eastern power, and it was always kind of trying to split the country so they kind of take over from there. So that was his idea.
Familiar.
Yeah, just a little bit.
Wink.
Wink, wink. What ends up happening is the plan fails. I think he had like 40 or 50 of his people killed. He fled and was arrested like a couple days later in some finca, put in prison. And during that time, he became kind of a bit of a cult phenomenon, in that he made this speech that was highly glorified after the fact. And my theory is, and I think I've read it into this, he said some speech, which was the history will absolve me. If you Google that, it has a whole thing about it, where he's basically saying, this is a corrupt government. This is not just, history's going to absolve me because you guys are on the wrong and I'm in the right in terms of this revolution is going to be it. If you see the version that's written out and that were given in pamphlets like months later, it's like absurdly long and embellished after the fact. So I think they ended up taking what he did and like embellishing it to the point. And I'm pretty sure Raul was the one kind of doing that, because he was always the smarter of the two in terms of the linguistic side of things. That becomes a catalyst for people to kind of, keep in the background of their mind and already see Fidel as like a potential leader in the future, as like somebody that's going to be rebelling this guy. But he was in prison. He was in prison for 2 years. The guy that gets him out of prison, because things are starting to calm down.
For what, the gangster shit that he was
for trying to take over the barracks and being a rebel. He was they were going to kill him potentially, but he survived somehow. Mm-hmm. Somehow this guy survived. Like that, literally the phrase that I've most associated with Fidel after seeing the story is somehow this guy survived, and then because it happened like 4 or 5 times, it was just like somehow this guy survived, and then
he's like a cat with 9 lives.
He really is. So later in the 50s, 55, things have calmed down a little bit. Batista ran for president, by himself pretty much, and then actually won, so that he's trying to legitimize himself. He's trying to legitimize himself because of the balance of power from the student side. And the students, as part of it, were like, okay, now you have to release political prisoners, which are part of ours, and some of the ones that were rebelling, including Fidel. Fidel, immediately after he leaves, is worried because they can't kill him in there because he's a martyr, but they can outside. So he's out for like maybe 2 months. He leaves to Mexico, but before he leaves, he's like, before the end of 1956, I declare that I will be back, and I will be coming back with an army to take over or whatever. Just being like braggadocious and all this other stuff. At this time, things were starting to get way, way more intense in terms of the students. There were a bunch of protests that were like shot up by the police. Camilo Cienfuegos was actually shot in one of these protests in Havana at it and almost died. Jose himself was beaten and like bloodied a few times with this stuff. They were starting to sense that we have to do more than just protest, and they're starting to look into taking actual political action. Now, the student rebels always thought of the way that they're going to do it is they kill the head of the snake. They were always trying to kill the top guy, versus Fidel's side was like, no, we're going to do a bottom-up rebellion from the people's side, versus the other side was just going to kill the top, take over from there, and then top down. So it was two competing factions and like the approach on how to take to the rebellion. Jose recruits Cubela to do an assassination, the first big assassination as part of the scheme, and the tragedy of it is that the way that they thought about things was, look, if we kill all the bad dudes, then like the ones that are assholes, then the ones that are left are the good dudes that are, they're still going to perpetuate this thing even though they're good dudes. What we have to do is kill the good dudes, and then the only ones left are the assholes, and people will not be able to stand it, and then they'll rebel. That was the idea behind it. one of the good dudes was this guy, Antonio Blanco Rico, who was the head of Batista's secret police. But he was always nice. He wouldn't torture anybody. He'd always let people go. He'd always be very gentle, even though he was in a position of power. He always used the power sparingly. He was at the Cabaret Montmartre visiting a couple of the other officers, and Cubela and this other guy Martinez were chosen to kill him, and I think they drew straws, and Cubela ended up having to actually do the shooting.
Drew straws.
He drew straws. Apparently, from my
who's
research,
gonna kill him? Draw a straw.
All right, who's gonna have to do it? And it's gonna have to be him. He drew the straw. He killed him. But as he's dying, he sees Cubela in the crowd. They make eye contact, and the guy smiles at him, like a full-on smile, and this fucks with Cubela's mind to the point where he had nightmares for years. He kept imagining this guy was in the same room with him.
Wasn't he used to killing people, or
he had never killed anybody before in his life. He's a medical student. They were doing protests and stuff. They were never doing anything outward. This was literally the first time he had I think he had been trained and they had been training and stuff, but he had never actually killed anybody. Right. And so this happens. It's a huge traumatizing moment for this guy. Really fucked with him. In the future, he was actually after the revolution, he was like getting drunk and like being partying, kind of like trying to take out like party his way out of the mental funk. And he ended up doing a hit and run, killing a girl like while he's driving, drunk. And apparently that brought back all the memories of Antonio Blanco Rico, seeing his face, seeing that smile. It was like a haunting thing. There's actually a couple of books that mention it. Like I found that were like CIA chronicles and other things about that particular story and how it affected his mental health, like moving forward for a while. And so but it was the first like kind of shot at, oh, we're really seriously gonna try to go after this guy. Batista responds like with a huge crackdown at that point, and ends up putting a bunch of these guys in jail. That same night, it was insane. So there's a guy named Rafael Salas Canizares who was just like this butcher. He was Batista's right hand man. I want him to be played by Gabriel Iglesias. He's a big fat.
Nice.
If you see on the trailer that you might play, he's like the guy that's going like this, and that was actual footage that I had colorized. So that was that actual dude. He goes and chases the people that are running from Cabaret Montmartre to the Haitian embassy, where there's already 12 or 13 other students that had been doing other things, like making trouble, and were hiding out there. He goes in there with a machine gun and guns down everyone. All of the students that were in there and one of the Haitian embassy people. And as one of the guys is dying on the floor, he shoots Canizares and kills him on the spot. So the same night at 3 a.m, Blanco Rico dies. And the next morning, like at 6 or 7 a.m, this guy gets killed. It's this whole, and I'm pretty sure Cubela was there, but just in the back somewhere. He ended up escaping to Miami with the help of Prio at that point.
Wow.
But it was this crazy chase through the streets of Havana from that side to the Haitian embassy, and then he's just saying, fuck it, and just going in there.
This is a crazy ass story.
I know.
I don't know how this isn't more popular.
I know. It's insane. Couple months go by. Fidel, being Fidel, he's like, he made the promise that he's going to be before 1956. Everyone knows it, so it's stupid because they're like waiting for him. And they're like, all right, come on in. He ends up buying this a ship, he calls it, for the Granma. It's just Grandma. And it's a boat that maybe can hold like 15, 20 people maximum. He loads it up with 90 people and guns.
Cubano thing.
And
putting a bunch
he had
of people
coordinated with another guy from Santiago named Frank Pais to kind of have this simultaneous raid on the east side while they landed and all this other stuff. The problem is that the boat was so heavy that it was delayed by 4 days. And they ended up going to the wrong spot. So if Pais does this whole thing in Santiago and there's no support, so he gets destroyed by the police and like all his people get fucked up. And then Castro's about to land, And they just start bombing the shit out of him because they already know where he's coming. They start bombing the shit out of him. They start gunning everybody. It was like 90 people. 6 survived. Woo. Raul, Camilo, Fidel, Che Guevara, and like 2 other guys. And that's it. Everybody else was wiped. At that point, the propaganda was, oh, Fidel's dead. Because they hadn't heard from him. They'd killed all these people. They did all this stuff. They hadn't gotten confirmation, but they said, Fidel is dead, and that's what they start reporting. This is December of 56. In February of 57, the New York Times comes around, and there's rumors that Fidel's alive. But with Batista's censorship and his oppression of it,
you wouldn't know.
You wouldn't know it, and he believes his own bullshit at that point. It's like, no, this guy's dead. This guy's dead. This guy's dead. The New York Times comes in and interviews him and shows him very much alive in the jungles, have this huge story. It makes him a celebrity worldwide. Now everyone knows about Fidel and this band of rebels in the jungles, and they're fighting against tyranny and all this, and people start to side with the rebellion over, the dictator, because it's just American culture. Everybody else is into it. Here's the problem. There's the factions between the DRE, which is Jose's movement, in Movimiento 27, which is the 26th of July movement, which was Castro's. They're competing to see who can get into power first. And they know that each of the factions is not going to be wanting to put the other one in power. They're one's, they said they weren't communists, but they have Che and Raul are like ardent communists. And Fidel the whole time is like, I'm not a communist.
He called himself a capitalist.
I'm a capitalist. What are you guys talking about? What do you mean? Like, give me a break. But Jose actually was not a communist. And so he moves up his own plan to try and take over power. So a month later, in March of 1957, he coordinates this attack, which they had been planning for months. 50 guys go raid the palace in Havana, while another 10 go to a radio station with Jose. Jose goes to the radio station, they take it over, and they start saying, the dictator is dead, take to the streets, go and rebel, you need to go out there, blah, 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 and he gets cut off. The 50 guys make it to Batista's office, but he's not there. He's upstairs in his secret bunker because of whatever reason. There's a
bunker was upstairs?
A 4th floor bunker. That was a secret thing that he kind of went up there. We don't know why. In the story, I'm going to make it as if he went to the bathroom there because he had a rotten croqueta. Okay, nice. Whatever the case may be, they don't kill Batista. In fact, 30 of their guys get killed, and like 15 of the guards get killed. A huge fight breaks out, and Jose starts getting chased from the radio station by the cops, ends up at the steps of the university, has a gun out, goes out of the car, and gets shot and killed on the steps of the university immediately at that moment. Wow. That's when Jose Antonio Echevarria is killed, March 13th, 1957. This devastates Cubela. Cubela escapes to Miami and is just absolutely depressed. Brio tries to get him out. Jose Aleman Jr. is his friend, trying to comfort him. He's staying at some hotel in Miami that Aleman owns. And a few months later, after all this stuff happens, Frank Pais also murdered in Santiago. So they basically go down and like find him, and then just literally, the one that killed him was the brother of Salas Canizares, another guy. It's like Ernesto Salas Canizares, or some other Salas Canizares who looks just like him. So that'll be Gabriel Iglesias again. So you think he's dead, and all of a sudden it's like, oh shit, that guy looks just like the other guy, and he's Salas Canizares. Yeah, it's his brother. So he's basically out there for blood, trying to kill this dude, and he does. He kills Frank Pais, and there's this huge movement in Santiago after Pais gets killed. You can see pictures of it. All these women in black. It was probably tens of thousands just outside and just being like, shame. Like, just like, yeah, for real. Like, but like all of them. So they're really hating Batista at this moment because he's cracking down. What ends up happening is there's now a growing rebel movement on the east side of the island where they're starting to get the peasants and everybody else involved. They've grown it to maybe like 30, 40 people. And now they split up. Raul and Castro and Fidel stay on the east side. Che goes to the middle of the country in Escambray with Camilo. And at that point, Cubela, who's getting help from Aleman and from Prio, takes a boat from Miami River in Brickell with like a bunch of other dudes and goes to Escambray, which is in the middle of the country, brings them all of these arms, and now is
on the boat. He just had a bunch of arms on the boat.
He had a fuck ton of arms on the boat with, like, I think it was like 10 or 20, like 20 or 30 other guys. So it was a coordinated thing. They go over there, all part of the DRE, all people that were following Jose, and they basically go there to unite with the rebellion movement. Be like, all right, well, we're gonna fight Batista because he killed Jose, and there's almost like a revenge thing. They get there, and because of his act and because of the, all of the thing, and trying to kind of ingratiate himself with that faction, Fidel makes him a comandante, which was like the highest rank. So now you have Comandante Cubela and Comandante Che, and those are the two heads of this army that's now attacking Santiago de Cuba, Santa Clara, Cuba. And there is a huge battle, of the Battle of Santa Clara, where they basically have a giant armored vehicle that has all of these armaments and these soldiers, and they end up derailing it. So this is giant train that just gets derailed out of nowhere as a surprise, because they were going to go to the east of the country to try to go after Fidel. They get him in Santa Clara, and all of those people immediately, like hundreds of soldiers, immediately flip. And now they have all of these arms. This is in December of 1958. At that moment, Batista's like, I'm fucked. Now they have the guns. Now they have the people. Now they have the soldiers.
I'm just thinking right now, like, where were my grandparents during all this? Like,
right. I told my dad this story. He's like, I didn't know any of this shit.
Like, it's crazy.
Crazy. So at that moment, it was like mid-December. He's already like, all right, I'm out of here. And then remember the famous Godfather 2, the scene where he just says, thank you very much. I'm out. And he's New Year's Eve, 1958 to 1959. He flees the country. He raids the treasury before he does. So this is a pattern.
Yeah.
So as soon as you're the deposed president, you raid the treasury, get the fuck out. Shit, yeah. So that's what ends up happening. Because Cubela and Che and Camilo are closer than Fidel and Raul, they get to Havana first. They get there, I think, January 1st, January 2nd. They just beeline to Havana. The people that are in charge of the palace are Cubela's people, because they're the ones with the guns, because they brought them. And Che wants that to take over the palace. He wants to be the one in charge. And they say, fuck you. You're a communist. We're not giving you the fucking power. And now already there's a skirmish between Cubela's faction, who's basically the de facto leader of Cuba at that moment for those few days, and Che's faction. During that time, Fidel takes an 8-day lounging tour from the east to the west as like gathering more and more supporters, people like cheering him in the streets on this other stuff. And on the way, he swings by Cárdenas, Cuba, to Jose Antonio Echevarria's old house and tries to convince his parents, his sister, and his brother to come with him so that they can convince Cubela to give up the palace.
Damn, that's trifling.
Okay, and Cubela has all of these armaments in different places. They're from Havana. He's the Havana guy. Fidel's from the east of the country. He'd gone to school in Havana, but Cubela's a Havana guy. So he has all these weapons caches, all of these potential ways to basically fight a civil war with the Castro side of things, and he's ready to go. And Fidel knows this. So what Fidel ends up doing is he trains a dove to basically be, to go on command. He gives this huge speech about peace and stuff, and all of a sudden this dove lands on his shoulder, and everybody in the crowd's like, "Oh my God, it's a sign of God! Bro, this guy's a peacemonger. He's bringing, look, the bird landed on him." There was this whole huge thing. It was everywhere, and what he did in that speech was say, "Armas por qué? Why do we need guns? What's the point of the guns? We already destroyed the tyrant. Why are we going to have more bloodshed here?" And he implored all the mothers of the Cubans to take away the guns from their kids in Havana. And that's what happened. And they ended up removing and confiscating all those gun caches that they had, got rid of him. And now...
Sounds familiar again. Wink, wink.
What's crazy is that the seminal moment for the NRA was that. Nice. Because what ends up happening is as the CIA and everybody's studying, like, this is the first time a communist revolution actually worked in our hemisphere. How did they do it? It's because they took the guns away. And since that moment, that's when the right wing went, fuck gun control. That's going to get you to communism. That's where that comes from this particular moment in history.
Wow.
All the gun control things that we talk about, all the stuff, all the right-wing tropes and all this stuff from that moment in Cuba. Because it was the first time that a communist revolution took over, and the way they did it is they took away the guns.
Wow. So at what point do Cubela and Raul Castro meet?
They met in the jungles. Well, they had met prior to it in Havana a couple times, but the scene that was played out in that document that's provided happened while they were in the jungles of Cuba, after Escambray and he had gone over there. So that's they had met there. They had some relations in some capacity. I told you this before. It seems from my gathering of information that he wasn't the only one that was at least bi or gay in terms of that faction. So Raul, probably Camilo Cienfuegos, because he was in San Francisco with his buddy for months, and then he got married for 6 months and then divorced. Like all the tropes that you can say, oh, he had a beard for a bit. He's like out in like San Fran with his male friend for months that he lived with for a while.
Rarito.
Un poquito, ¿sabes? You know, but he had to have the marriage, so nobody would have thought about it. Like you can see all these things. Che Guevara, traveling for months with his buddy on a motorcycle, going all the way through South America. Very similar situation. There were a lot of signs that a lot of these dudes were on the down low with each other. Right. The only one that 100% was not down for that was Fidel. Fidel was un mujeriego. He probably had like 15 kids.
He has a ton of kids.
Lots of kids. Like, dude is as straight as that. But everybody else in that faction
questionable
was probably at least okay with it. And so a lot of those relationships ended up getting played out while Camilo was, popular. He started getting even more popular because he also was from Havana. And at one point in October of 1960, he made this speech from the palace where there was literally 1 million people in the plaza. And you can see Fidel standing next to him, kind of looking at him like, yeah, okay. And what Fidel is very much like the Highlander. What he'll do to you is he'll kill you, but then he won't shit on your grave. He'll make you into a martyr and a star and then basically take your energy. He did that with Jose Antonio Echevarria. He did that with Camilo because less than a month later, Camilo was flying from the east of the island to the west on a plane, and then his plane disappeared and he's gone. Like literally just wiped off the face of the earth. My father, who was in the Navy at the time, he was younger at that point, and was friends with Hugo Matos, or Uber Matos? Yeah, Uber Matos. His theory is that they put sugar in the gasoline tank, and they basically made sure that he'd crash and die and got rid of him that way. So he gets rid of Camilo. Camilo's face is all over the Plaza de la Revolución as one of the heroes of the revolution. And then, years later, Che Guevara is killed in Guatemala, and now Che Guevara is on the So he basically, his political enemies, what he does is he builds them up, he kills them, and then uses the power behind them to then rally for his own cause. It's brilliant.
Emotional manipulation, basically.
Yeah, just a bit. But after Camilo's killed, and all the crazy shit that's happening, Lucy Echevarria, she ends up leaving in 61, and
his wife.
That's Jose's little sister.
Little sister.
She became part of the CIA as well, and she basically tried to recruit him into it. He was always kind of back and forth, but he was actually given the moniker Amlash by the CIA in mid 1961 with the hopes that he would kill Castro, because he was like, I want to kill Fidel, I want to take over. During the Bay of Pigs, the actual Bay of Pigs process, the guy that was supposed to take over was Cubela. Cubela was supposed to be the basically the stand-in of the leadership after the invasion went through and was successful, except it wasn't because of the political things that happened in the U.S. and all the things, and we can get into that as well. I don't know how you want me to take this, but at the end of the day, they tried to kill Fidel like 250 times. This guy wanted to shoot him from afar and then get out because he didn't want to die, and he refused to be called an assassin because of the mental trauma from the killing of Blanco Rico from 1956. Like you see it, all this stuff. He's like refuses to call himself an assassin. He wants to execute or he wants to take care of it, but he would never say the word assassinate because it would just fuck with him. And he later on had requested to meet with Robert Kennedy to have a liaison with him.
That was going to be my next question. At what point do the Kennedys
get involved in the 60s? JFK gets elected in 1960. So let me back up for 1 second. The president and vice president from 1952 to 1960 were Eisenhower and Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was the vice president. Richard Nixon created a force called Operation 40, which became part of the CIA later on. And Nixon was working hand in hand with the CIA with the invasion plans of Cuba. Nixon had already met Fidel when he came over, saw him as naive or as a communist. So he was already kind of like, all right, this guy's dead to me. We're going to take over. And the assumption was that Nixon was going to win the presidency. And the plans were already put in place to take over in April of 1961. So if you think about the time frame here. The election took place in November of 1960. He was inaugurated in January of 1961. They didn't tell him about the operation until the day, like a few days before he was inaugurated. Normally they would tell the presidential candidates, these are the things that we're going to be doing. They didn't give him any heads up because they thought he was going to lose. So Kennedy gets thrown all this stuff about this invasion plan of Cuba, and he's like, no, I had a promise that I'm not going to send government, like U.S. troops to the island. So you're going to have to change what you're doing. So like, all right, well, we're training this force of Cubans in Guatemala to take over. Some of the people that were in that training area, George Bush, the original, was there.
In Guatemala?
In Guatemala, helping train the Cubans. There were a few other, Howard Hunt, Frank Sturgis. So these people that keep coming up later on in the Nixon administration, very, very involved in this portion of it. And basically, they end up changing where they're going to land. They say, well, and Kennedy asks Dulles, who was the CIA director at the time, are they going to be able to do this without American support? Or are they able to join? Oh yeah, they'll be fine. They'll do this for sure. And Dulles had done this a few times with other presidents, especially Eisenhower, where they'd say, yeah, it'll be fine. And then at the last minute, he's like, we need to send in the troops, sir. We need to do this. We need to do that. And then, the prior presidents would always capitulate, be like, oh yeah, no, we have to save face. We have to make sure that they don't die. We have to do all this stuff. Dulles tries to do that with Kennedy, and he's like, no, I told you, we're not sending in troops. Like I said that beforehand, I'm not sending in troops. Why would you think I'm going to send in troops now? Dulles and the Joint Chiefs are going nuts. They're like telling him, we need the support. We need to send this in. Those people are going to die. And Kennedy's like, I'm not going to save face. Yeah. And he ends up just not doing anything. It was 4 days that they were there thinking that they were going to get air support. All those guys that trained in Guatemala that were Cubans that were trying to take over. And they end up getting wiped out because they just don't get resupplied, and they don't get air support. A few of them die, but then most of them get captured as prisoners. And then Fidel's just like, at the moment that happens, at that point, Fidel hadn't shown his full hands that he was going communist or socialist. He was actually trying to court the U.S. side while Raul was courting the USSR side. But because of the administration and the way that things were going with the U.S., because of that invasion, the day that it happened is the speech that he gives, we are socialist, we are Marxist, we are with the Russians. Like that's the day that happens. So we basically they both pushed each other into that situation. And then it was escalation after escalation. Like they had escalated beforehand where they were like, oh, we're gonna cut your sugar subsidies or your sugar quota. And then Fidel a few months later is like, oh, well, we're gonna just take over Texaco and all of your oil refineries and make them ours. So I'm like, oh, well, we're gonna just set up an embargo and fuck you up completely. And there was just this tit for tat that happened over 2 weeks and has remained there since the 1960s.
That's so wild.
It's insane. All that happened in 60. So the socialist thing happens in 61. And now the Russians see an opening. They're like, this motherfucker's weak. He couldn't even take over the little island that's next to it. Let's see how far we can push it. At that moment is when they decide, let's put some nukes on Cuba. And Fidel's over the moon. Fidel's like, this is the best thing ever. Now I'm going to have actual firepower to go against the Americans. Little did they know. So then, fast forward about a year, October of 1962, we have a U-2 spy plane going over Cuba, and they see the missiles. And they're like, sir, there seem to be nuclear missiles inside of Cuba. We need to go and take over right now. And Kennedy was like, look, I'm not going to just take over when they have nukes. We got to figure something out. We can't do nothing. So they end up coming up with an idea to do a blockade. So they're going to stop everybody from coming in, which is technically an act of war. So technically
it is, yeah.
They're blocking everything from coming in and basically doing inspections. Fidel at that moment's like, fucking kill them. Fucking shoot the nukes right now. Let's go. And unbeknownst to everyone on the American side who were pushing for the invasion, they already had the nukes positioned and pointed at Miami, at New York, at DC at that moment. And if there had been a hint there was an actual invasion, all of us would have been wiped out immediately. And then it would have been just nukes here, nukes there, boom. The whole thing goes fucking everywhere. And the guy that wanted to push the button was Fidel. Fidel was pushing to push the button. It scared Khrushchev so much that they're like, we're gonna chill here, man. We're gonna chill out here. Let's see what we can do. Because he got scared, and he had his own faction of the military kind of pushing him towards war. Thankfully, JFK and Khrushchev had a direct line to each other installed a few years before, when the whole Cuba thing happened, so they could talk to each other directly, and they did. And they basically were like, look, this guy in the fucking island is insane. He's gonna destroy the world. And they end up, without Fidel's permission, having this whole negotiation, not including him at all, and taking the nukes out. And he was adamant that he was trying to keep them there. And he was like, we're not going to let them inspect anything here. So they did the inspections on the ships outside of Cuba to get around Fidel. And the deal that they struck was, look, you have Jupiter missiles in Turkey. We don't like those. Remove those. Remove the ones from Cuba. And you have to promise you're not going to invade Cuba. And JFK is like, deal. That's how we'll avoid nuclear war. So at that point is when the promise is made that they're never going to invade Cuba. But what they ended up doing was instead saying, okay, well, we're not going to invade Cuba. We need to get rid of this fucking crazy guy. So they're going to do Operation Mongoose, which is now the Kennedy's version of trying to kill Castro. They're trying to give him an exploding cigar, a shell, an exploding shell, all the crazy ways that they try to kill him. That's where that comes from. And one of the ones that they try to do is with Rolando Cubela in 1963. He has requested to meet with RFK, who was the Attorney General at the time, and happens to meet with the third Kennedy brother, Desmond Fitzgerald, which they called. So they technically didn't lie to him. One of the Kennedy brothers is going to come meet with you. And it was this guy, Desmond Fitzgerald. Desmond Fitzgerald hands him a ballpoint pen that can work as a syringe to basically inject Fidel or put a poison with that pen syringe.
I wonder how many attempts there were to kill Fidel. And
it was hundreds of them. That meeting took place on November 22nd, 1963, the same day that John F. Kennedy was killed. So technically speaking, the Cubela was supposed to meet with RFK the same day that JFK was killed. And my theory is that the plot behind all of this...
This is the part I like.
...was that there was going to be a double assassination that same day. And by involving a Cuban agent, which I don't think Cubela was in on it, but they were going to probably kill him at the same time, JFK is killed, RFK is killed, a Cuban is involved, take over Cuba, and then kill the Castros and both Castro brothers. Basically, the powers that be would take out all of their problems at once, kill both sets of brothers, and now they're sitting pretty. That seems to be...
I wonder who would have orchestrated all that.
I mean, after 1961 and the debacle that was the Bay of Pigs, Allen Dulles was fired as the director of the CIA. And JFK specifically said that he wanted to tear the CIA up into 1 million pieces.
Yeah, right.
He says this. The person that was put in charge of the investigation of killing JFK was Allen Dulles.
Wow.
By LBJ and by FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. You know, and Dulles, even though it was called the Warren Commission, Dulles was the only one that didn't have a job during that time. Everybody else has a full-time job. He's literally the only one doing it full-time. And most of the report is a history of Lee Harvey Oswald. So they've already kind of pegged this guy as the killer, and then they're basically making everything out to be him. Except that, and this is also unbeknownst to a lot of these people, from what I've researched and what I've seen, it's a very high likelihood that Lee Harvey Oswald was CIA.
Wow.
He was in Moscow for a while and then came back. There was a bunch of the story has changed. We're like, we've never seen Oswald. It's like, well, we were monitoring him a little bit. Well, we were monitoring him a lot. Well, he had sung by the FBI office. Well, we had him doing, like 2 weeks before the killing, he was out there like promoting like a bunch of communist stuff and like getting into a fight with an anti-communist one, Carlos Berenger, who was part of the DRE, originally from the Cuban, that Cuban faction that was Jose Antonio became its own.
The university.
Like, well, it was the Directorio Estudiantil. They became its own faction in the U.S. that was very right-wing. Alpha 66 came from that. A bunch of the people that were basically virulently anti-communist and here came from that portion of it. And those people were involved in like a skirmish with Oswald about like anti-communist and communists in Cuba and all this other stuff. Seems like the larger plot was maybe this guy dies and then maybe we have an excuse to kill and take over Cuba.
I mean, it sounds perfectly plausible, you know?
And then, there's all sorts of stuff with Vietnam and Nixon and all this other stuff, but,
So don't give all the goods away.
No. We'll get there. But just to give you a little bit of the last bit of this, with Cubela, he actually finally, because he had been wanting a silenced rifle to basically kill Fidel that way, they finally gave it to him. But in 1965, he goes silent after he had met with Manuel Artime, who was another big guy in the revolution. And he gets imprisoned and put in basically saying, oh, you're rebelling against the state and all this other stuff, and sentenced to death afterward. And he said, like, kill me, go ahead. And at the last minute, there's a letter to the judge to give him reprieve from Fidel. And so he's put in prison instead of getting killed. From 65 to 79, he stays in prison, and then he's let out where he moves to Spain and becomes a doctor. And he was just a doctor for
that's it. That was
decades and decades, and then moved to Miami in like 2022, and then he passed away in like 97.
Yo. Bro, before we wrap up, tell me about the research process, because I know you're a lawyer. You're no stranger to researching. How was that for you? It
was intense, man, because I must have read 15, 20 books on the subjects in Spanish and in English from different perspectives. Like I read Roger Stone, I read Oliver Stone, like all the both Stones from both sides,
right.
like saw the Stone movie. Like it was really interesting to see the different perspectives from people and seeing what we were doing, what they were doing. A lot of archives from the JFK assassination docs. I'm just like searching Cubela, searching this, searching that. I went into old newspaper archives as well and saw like, articles from the New York Times from back in the day and Cuban Gazette and like a bunch of other, La Bohemia and a bunch of places. kind of putting all this together, this tapestry of things that, it's interesting as fuck, because literally anything changes here, the world's a different place.
It's a different course in history.
It's a completely different course in history. And this guy was kind of along for the ride for a lot of it. He was like kind of like the Forrest Gump of this stuff, where he's just kind of there, and he's not playing a particularly important role himself necessarily, but he's at least part of it enough that he's affecting it. I mean, he was literally technically the leader of Cuba for 8 days, from Jan 1 to Jan 8, 1959, and then they put somebody in. But he was the guy. He was holding the power, and his decisions kind of affected the rest of the entire world.
It's crazy to think the amount of influence that Cuba actually had during that period of time that people are kind of oblivious to. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And it's all frozen in time from that time frame too. That's the crazy. Like the trauma happened, and then now we still have cars from the 50s.
Yeah, right.
It's kind of frozen in place because of this stuff. So it's like, Jose. There's a funny little anecdote about how Fidel kind of does stuff. He took over Jose Antonio Echevarria's house and made it a museum. So now it's actually a museum, and it's like the Casa Natal.
To this day?
To this day.
Wow.
People go to it and they're like, oh, there's a nice little museum. And they put a bunch of random shit in. It's like, no, that's his childhood home that Fidel just said, oh, now it's ours now, and we're going to make it a museum.
Martyr. There you go.
Oh, he's a martyr.
Yeah.
He's like a huge hero.
That's his specialty.
Of the revolution. He's a huge hero of the revolution, even though he absolutely despised Fidel.
That guy, bro.
That guy. One of my motivations with this too is that I want a more realistic depiction of Fidel.
So that was my next
film.
question. My next question to you was, what's your end game? What do you want the audience to experience, and where would you want this to go ideally?
Ideally, so I launched it as a graphic novel because my original idea was as a musical, like I said, with the Hamilton thing. But what really kind of it coalesced to was a Game of Thrones style TV show, where you have that style of storytelling, like The Crown, Narcos, right. Game of Thrones, kind of all those combined.
It's the perfect storyline for that.
It's the perfect storyline, and seeing it kind of grow from there, having some of these actors I would want Andy Garcia to play Carlos Brioso Carras.
Nice.
I would want Oscar Nunez, who's Cuban, by the way, the guy from The Office.
No.
Oscar, he's Cuban. He was born in Cuba in 1958.
Oh shit, I had no idea.
He like moved when he was 3 and he went to Venezuela. But
Sweet.
The guy's Cuban. I want him to play Batista. I want Gabriel Iglesias to play Salas Canizares. Mm-hmm. And I want he's like my boy in spirit because he's Cuban. He's like out there. Marcelo Hernandez from SNL. I want him to play Cubela. And then nice. Our buddy Carlos, I want him to play Jose. I see Jose as like the Ned Stark of the series, in that everybody's gonna fall in love with this guy, and then he gets shut down, and he gets wiped out.
Spoiler. I hope you guys haven't seen.
It's history, baby. It is what it is. But he's gonna be he's that guy where everybody and the course of history really could have changed if Batista wasn't taking a shit. if they had killed him at that point. Jose takes over in 1957. They probably bring back the Constitution. There's probably elections. JFK is maybe or maybe not elected. Who knows? But if he is, he's not. There's no reason for him to get assassinated because there's no invasion of Cuba. He probably served 2 terms. There's probably no Vietnam. There's probably no communist influence in Cuba. There's probably no you can kind of go from there. Martin Luther King is probably not killed. There's a completely different
the domino effect.
A completely different world.
The butterfly effect.
Butterfly effect. In terms of what happens from that one moment, all of history that we know could have changed, and we literally wouldn't even be here because my parents met in the 80s in Venezuela, even though they're both Cuban. Why would they be there? They would have been Cuban.
Yeah, you wouldn't have been here.
I wouldn't have been here.
Brother, so tell the viewers and listeners where they can find the rest of your content, where they can keep up with all things
definitely
Adrian and Cubela Libre.
For sure. So you can follow me on all socials at YoAdrian305. Pretty easy to remember. See, my name's anybody that's that's like in their 40s, that's a dude that sees my name, they're like the first thing they go is like, Yo Adrian, because of the Rocky reference. Nobody gets that, it's younger. So I was like, okay, I'm just gonna go with it. So YoAdrian305 is my handle. CubelaLibre.com. You can go there. I have the first 7 pages of the comic up. And what's cool about it is I'm using AI. So I'm an artist myself, but I'm more painting and that type of thing. I kind of chicken scratch the thing, and I wanted to get it out. It was more going to be I wanted that to be what's that thing where you do a storyboard. I wanted a storyboard of this thing. So this is more of a storyboard in that, I want this to be kind of like the first episode of Cubela Libre is kind of this first issue is what I would want it to be. But I actually one of the panels I was using AI to kind of help out with like these glasses or whatever, and I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. So I was like, you know what, I'm gonna do a full let me just throw all the AI at this so that I can to make it kind of have its own style, and I actually have an AI version of the first 7 pages up as well that you can kind of see, and it goes into. I kind of showed you a couple previews of the AI side of things, and I'm still working on the rest of that. My goal with this, I want to get funding in some capacity. I'm going to start a Kickstarter, so you guys can just follow along with that. I have a Patreon as well. I'm hoping to get some investment to make this thing a reality, to actually create the TV show, and then distribution wise, there's streaming services out there, but I think there's a lot of potential for decentralized content coming up. A lot of Web3 side of things that you can do with it. There's a thing called the IPFS, if you haven't looked into it, and, is the technology behind it is the same thing as BitTorrent. So if you ever did Napster or BitTorrent or these other things
back in the day,
the way that technology works is no one person has the entire file in their own library. The torrent is basically just you've split up this file into a bunch of little pieces, and now a bunch of people have a bunch of the different pieces, and the torrent kind of brings it all together from a decentralized portion. IPFS works in a very similar way, where it's not the files themselves distributed, it's the hash of the file. So when you hash something, it's like you're encrypting it. So for crypto and all this other stuff, you're basically getting that, running through an encryption, and then it comes up with like a bunch of lines and numbers and things like that. It's gobbledygook. But then if you know what that encryption answer is, you can then decrypt it back to its original form. So what this does is you're getting content of any portion. It could be a picture, letter, file, whatever. You're hashing it. And then that hash, instead of being, having to look through folders for a place, you're saving the name of it, because if you have the name of it, you can then decrypt it. And so a bunch of the different pieces of the files are kind of distributed, and what it allows for, the reason why what people were using it for was for NFTs, because if you have a picture of the NFT, instead of it being hosted on google.com or something, it's hosted on the IPFS, so it's less likely to get taken down by it's censorship proof in that sense, where it's distributed amongst a lot of different people. So one of the things that I'm thinking with this is put this on IPFS, but there's a way to do it where it's private, where you kind of encrypt the encryption. So if you have the key, you're basically giving access to people whenever you want to, and having the ability for people to buy something to get access to it that way, so that I can cut out the middlemen. And I think that's really going to be the way creators, we were talking a little bit beforehand in terms of Andrew Schultz and a few of these other guys that have done their own thing and putting out stuff directly. I think that's going to be the future of content distribution.
100%. Decentralization in general is the future.
The power's in the hands of the creators. Even with AI, AI is a tool that you can use as a creator to do this stuff. Like AI can come up with all the things and do all the stuff, but unless there's a human kind of directing that process, it's not going to speak to real humans unless it's, we go crazy with like the AI, AGI, and then we have other problems at that point. But I really feel like it's going to be a tool that's going to allow for more creators to really create stuff that's viable in the marketplace, that like I don't have to go to a studio to go create something. I can just potentially do this myself. And if I'm able to do that, why would I share with some random studio and all this stuff? If I can distribute it and people can buy it directly, it's censorship proof. So I don't have to be looking around and be like, hey, I'm saying some shit about some people here.
I'm sure they'll come up with something.
But it's at least a little bit less likely that it can get taken down. And so, having that freedom to be able to do it, against censorship and being able to monetize it in a way, I think that's a goal of mine, to kind of, push this portion of it. But the reality is, I just want the story to be told, man. Like, I found it so fascinating, and so, and obviously I took a deep dive into it, and I feel like an expert on it now just because I've accumulated so much knowledge of the whole process. But it feels like something that people would be really, really interested in, and I just want the story to be told. However it ends up happening.
I love it, bro. I love it, and I'm looking forward to the future issues because you definitely have something here. So, cheers to success.
Awesome.
Yo, Adrian, thank you for joining me, man.
Appreciate it, Jose.
Appreciate it. That's all the time we got for today, guys. Please remember to like, subscribe, share, do all the things, as I said earlier. And that's it. That's all the time we got for today. That's it. As always, no se venda con nadie para que nadie se las meta. Have a good one.